Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Fordham Business and Law Association's In Conversation. Today, I have with me David Feher from Winston & Strawn. He is the co-chair of the firm's sports law practice. He has served as outside counsel for the NFL Players Association and the NBA Players Association. He's one of the prime negotiators of the collective bargaining agreements and antitrust settlements in the NFL and NBA. Since 2005, he has been recognized by Chambers USA as one of the country's leading sports attorneys. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, good morning. It's good to be here.
Thanks so much. So I see you graduated from Duke University with your JD. Did you always know you wanted to be involved in sports law, or was that something that you came to realize later in your career?
It was actually the opposite. And I think it's kind of a comment on how life works sometimes. When I started off in law, well, let me start even before then. If it's okay. I originally, when I was growing up, I was the 9th of 10 kids. My father was a blue-collar worker in Pittsburgh, worked for Westinghouse Electric. And I grew up in the 1970s when it was a time of political ferment. And it's ancient history now, but in the 1970s, Watergate was, the issue of the day. And so when people think of whatever's happening in today's media headlines, it was much the same, but in an earlier generation. I mean, with different issues, but you can imagine the same level of kind of partisan debate. Interestingly, at the time, lawyers were very much in the public eye, and lawyering was considered, an act of heroism by a lot of people and a way to shape the way the world would be. And to the extent that people wanted the world to be in a different place, a principal means of effecting change in whichever direction you wanted was through the law. And I came from a family where my father was a blue-collar worker, and he wanted me to be an engineer more than anything else. And so I started off actually kind of following, not in my father's footsteps, but in the footsteps of what his dreams were for me, because I started off going to Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland, where I was going to study physics and, maybe engineering, which was what my father wanted. I didn't want to be an engineer. But the notion of kind of uncovering the deep secrets of how the universe and the world was constructed was something that was appealing to me. But then about a year and a half in, I realized that it just wasn't for me. And that I was looking at, printouts of circuit maps and, having debates with people as to what the relative velocity was of a pi muon, at a certain angle doing this or that. And it just didn't sing with my soul, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And there was a late night where a friend of mine said, "Is this what you want to do?" And I decided no. And the next day I woke up and I didn't go to my circuits exam midterm. I didn't go to my physics midterm. I actually dropped out of Case Institute of Technology and transferred into Western Reserve University, and sent off that same day for an application to transfer to Georgetown University, because Washington, D.C. and politics, it was, kind of the center of the universe on the legal side. And I knew that was something that I wanted to do. I was always kind of determined and argumentative to some degree. But I also saw it as a way where, to the extent that I wanted to kind of have an impact, that it fit me. And so I went to Georgetown. I had no idea as to how I was going to pay for it. I ended up getting a scholarship for poor little Catholic boys who went to Georgetown's College of Arts and Sciences, who grew up in the city of Pittsburgh, which was kind of ridiculous that it existed. I didn't even know that it existed when I applied to transfer. but it's like one of the lessons as to how fate intervenes. And sorry to get personal, but if people are asking, how do you end up in a certain spot? Life really is like, people say a current in a river, and you don't really know which direction it's going to take you. And there are so many points in time where I could have ended up in a different spot. It's like unbelievable. And so I ended up in Georgetown, and in a way where I could afford it. And I did well, and then I applied to Duke to go to law school there. And I did well there, but I was kind of, going into, well, I want to be a lawyer. My attitude was kind of arrogant, to tell you the truth. And, it's kind of lessons you learn as time goes by, because I thought, oh, I'm going to like remake the world, consistent with my thoughts, and I'm going to be the best lawyer in the world. And I worked hard, and I did well and all that stuff. But at the same time, kind of my premise was along the lines of, well, I'm going to go to the best law firm in the world and, be at the top of the legal profession. And the reason I say that in terms of sports is that I remember when I was a first year law student, I would hear, oh, there's this sports law class that was taught by a professor at Duke. His name is John Wiestart, and who was my contracts professor. And people said, oh, you really should take sports law, and it's amazing. And my general reaction at the time was, oh, sports law isn't really law. And I was kind of dismissive at the time, which was not really the right thing to be at all. But at the same time, it's funny, because at the time, the sports industry then was completely different than it is now. If, think about it, I was in college in the late 70s. I graduated from Georgetown in 1980. I took a year off, worked at a law firm, and then I graduated from college in 1984. In the early 1980s, there was money to some degree in sports in terms of the industry. But if you look at franchise values, and if you look at player salaries, if you look at coaches' salaries, if you look at college TV contracts, sponsorship arrangements, things like that, it was a completely different world. I remember in 1984, when I graduated from law school, I hadn't been outside of the United States, and I took this big trip in Europe. And, I went from place to place with various friends, but I remember being in Munich at the time and thinking, I really want to get a jersey for Bayern München, the Bundesliga soccer team, because I thought it would be cool and nice to do that. And so this was 1984. I went from sports store to sports store to sports store, trying to find a jersey that was Bayern München's, authentic jersey. It was impossible to get, because it just wasn't anything that was done. And mostly I got puzzled looks from the people there. They were along the lines of, well, do you want to buy a soccer ball? Do you want, a football? Or why would you want to do this? It didn't really make sense to people as to why someone would want to like personally associate themselves with their football team in this kind of personal way, where you would spend that kind of money for something like that in particular. It just wasn't part of the culture at the time. And even in the United States, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh, they were rabid sports fans. The Steelers exploded in the 1970s in terms of going from the basement to being, 4 Super Bowl champions and all that stuff. But it was all pretty, from an economic point of view, rudimentary. People would buy terrible towels. What was a terrible towel? It was like a yellow towel that you would wave. And so the revenues were completely different. And as an industry, it was completely different. And sports as a component part of our society just had a different role then. And if you go back and if you ever watch on the classic videos, I remember going back and watching the seventh game of the 1971 World Series where the Pittsburgh Pirates won. And the thing was, first off, if I remember right, I think it was a day game. It wasn't in prime time at all. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that there was only one night game that series that was earlier on. It was a day game. The media didn't really focus on it. The announcers kind of went through it very, very quickly. The game was fast. It was only like 2 hours and 11 minutes or something. And when you watch the broadcasters and when you watch how it was produced, apart from the production values, you could tell the game was considered not a very big deal. It was the seventh game of the World Series, and at the end of the broadcast, it was along the lines of, okay, and we're going to have these football games on next. And so in terms of these events being kind of central components of people's lives, to the same degree with the focus in the media as it is today. And I'm not saying that it's either good or bad, because in some ways it's good because people have more free time. They have, something that's important to them. I would never, ever, I mean, I grew up in Pittsburgh, for God's sakes, in the 1970s. So I understand the importance to the sports of the fanaticism and the support of sponsors and the support of fans, and how it can make people's lives so much more enjoyable in a way to root for your home team, and so, but at that time, the sports industry as a career path didn't exist nearly the same. So I went to a Wall Street law firm, it was a securities firm. And after a while, I realized I wasn't really a securities lawyer. It was kind of like, act two of the same thing. And the question was, well, what do I want to do in terms of my legal career? What's my real focus? And, at the same time, I remember having cases where there were breach of contract cases about, manufacturing equipment breaking in a factory. And I thought, well, this is good. I can show off my kind of like skills. But in terms of what I cared about, how much do I care about, the allocation of liability with respect to this broken piece of machinery? It wasn't going to drive me to wake up in the morning. And God bless people. And also, and I don't want to diminish this at all, Lord knows that even getting a job and making a living and pursuing a legal career, that's for so many folks, it's like, it's such a dream come true. I don't ever want to give even a hint that these things aren't important, because they also are important in terms of factories which employ people and all of that, and make things. But it was just kind of, I always dreamed big, so to speak, and I always wanted to do something that would make a difference in some way. And so I ended up looking at various firms, and I came into it randomly. I interviewed with Weil Gottschall, where I happened to interview on that day with Jeff Kessler, who's now been my partner for decades, okay? And I walked into the interview room in Jeffrey's office, and he was on the phone with Patrick Ewing and David Falk, who was Patrick's agent, and they were arguing about an arbitration they were maybe going to have about Patrick's contract, where he was supposed to be one of the highest paid players in the NBA according to a specific clause. And I was sitting there listening to this, and I thought, what did I just walk into? What is going on here? It didn't really make sense to me. And when it was done, Jeffrey said, oh, I'm sorry, I know I do antitrust and we do intellectual property and assorted other things that matched up with what I happened to be doing at the time. And it is interesting because I loved antitrust, and I was also good with numbers, okay? And so the background in the sciences actually ended up making a difference in my life, because when someone would say mean, median, mode, it didn't scare me. And when we were talking about, standard deviations, it didn't scare me. When we talked about, all sorts of arithmetic concepts, it didn't scare me. So dealing with economists, I actually considered economics to kind of be a fuzzy science, so to speak. And so I would always try and dig deep, but I was used to dealing with experts. And so at that first meeting, Jeffrey said, no, you don't have to work on sports. And I said, no, I don't want to. But then I joined Weill Gottschall, but then about a couple months into at the firm, I got a call from Jeffrey and he said, look, I know I promised that you wouldn't have to work on sports, but I need you to help out on this because we're working on this case that's important, this NFL free agency case. Because NFL players did not have any right to be employed anywhere except the team that drafted them or signed them initially, and then they would have to work there for the rest of their lives. And what ended up happening was that there was, and this is nobody's fault, there was just like a little personality conflict between the then senior associate who was working with our economist on the economics of free agency and the value of players, so to speak, in more competitive markets. In that this person had a very dry personality and the economist, it just didn't fit quite so well. And so Jeffrey said, can you help out on this? I know you're good with numbers. I know you're good with experts. I know you're good with, economists. So if you can help out. And so I said, oh, okay. I ended up helping out, but then a deposition needed to be done of Dan Reeves, okay, who was then coach of the Denver Broncos. And I went and took Dan Reeves' deposition and asked him questions that ended up kind of undermining his testimony so much that he wasn't named as a witness because he was going to testify that free agency was a really bad thing. And it's interesting, just a short lesson in terms of kind of litigation tactics. People have, I don't want to say buttons to be pushed, but everyone, when you're speaking with them and you're trying to persuade people and you're just having a conversation and communicating, you got to read on them and you get a sense as to what they care about. And I found out very early in that deposition that Dan Reeves was really, really proud of his work when he started to be a head coach as to how well that team did. And so I asked him a series of questions where it was, okay, coach, your first year you were head coach, you had to get rid of a lot of players, right? Oh yeah, turned over massive numbers of players. And you had to change the whole system, right? Oh yeah, everyone had to relearn the plays all over again. And your system, it used odd numbers, even numbers for this player, that, oh yeah, we switched it completely. Everyone needed to do it completely differently. A huge theory of the NFL in that free agency trial was that players moving from team to team would be disastrous to the sport because the game would get chaotic and it would become an unappealing product. And so Reeves was going to testify that if players moved from team to team, they would like bump into each other. And, it sounds nutty today, but that the product would become unappealing. And so at the end of this, I asked Coach Reeves, I said, okay, after all of this stuff where you changed, how did your team do that year? He goes, 10-4, made the playoffs or whatever it was. But it's like so typical of what happens when you're trying to be a good lawyer, where you find kind of the weak spots in your opponent's case and draw them out in a way. And I did other depositions, and then we had the free agency trial. All that I'm saying is, and I've gone on a bit, but if you ask me, how do you end up in a particular spot? You can aim to be in a particular area of the law and end up there. But if not, that happens all the time. It happened with me, it happens with other people. And I know so many people who've had amazingly fulfilling careers in totally different areas than where they intended. And if you ask me what the key is to doing well in sports law, in particular, it's like it is in almost anything, which is you have to have the skills to bring to bear in the first place so that when the opportunity comes, you can perform at a very, very high level so that you're valuable to the team and you're valuable to the people you're working with. So they say, I want to work with this person and they're helpful and they're going to help us win, okay, if you're a litigator. Now, sports law, not everyone's a litigator. And even though I'm a litigator, I do tons of negotiations. But there, winning isn't like beating the other person and having a jury verdict in your favor. There, it's having a deal that, by the way, both sides agree upon. And so there, winning isn't beating up the other side so that they're crying and they never want to deal with you again. No, winning is actually getting a mutually acceptable deal that makes both sides kind of more valuable and happy, and especially if you're in a long-term relationship, wanting to do it again. And for a lot of businesses, it's not a one-off. Okay, very rarely in anything are you involved in one-off transactions. I mean, the more valuable relationships are continuing relationships. I mean, those are things that will count. And so if you're asking me, and by the way, we're people too, and we deal with each other. And if you want someone to agree with you, they have to trust you on a certain level. And you don't always have to be best friends. You don't always have to have your interests aligned. But at the same time, if you do a deal, an agreement, a contract together, then both sides need to know that it's enforceable and that they're going to be able to perform under it and they're going to be able to do well under it. And so when you're negotiating, you know, it's an old saw, but you know, win-win agreements are very, very important. And looking at things so that you say, okay, how can we reach a deal that's going to help both of us, is generally a better way to go about it. And I've been in negotiations so often, okay, I got to tell you, where Jeffrey or someone else or me, you know, where you're talking with the other side and you're negotiating, and a big part of it is, no, you should do this too because it'll help you, okay? They don't really need to hear why it's going to help, you know, their negotiating partner. That's kind of a given. But kind of discovering ways to structure agreements so that it's helpful to both sides is very, very important. I'll tell kind of things through little stories, but a big part of the free agency trial and the negotiation afterwards was a process of the owners being convinced, and this was a battle internal within the NFL, but it's true to this day. Some people care more about control and exercising control because it makes their day-to-day life easier. And back when, their coaches and general managers, they cared more about exercising control over their players, okay? Their careers are on the line too, the coaches and GMs. And the more they can control things, the more they feel like that things are less random and they can, you know, have their own skill brought to bear. And some owners care more about control than others, but the ones who do well and best are the ones who are willing to cede a certain amount of control in exchange for increased value. And that was incredibly the case with the NFL free agency trial from the beginning, and it's incredibly the case in all the negotiations we've done then, where the other side understands, yes, I can agree to this, and it's going to allow me to run my business better and make more money. And when you look at the NFL, there have been a couple of things that have gone on. Free agency in the NFL and in the other sports is a great contributor of underlying value in the business because it allows bad teams to get better quicker. And ultimately, as a team, you're selling hope to your fans, okay? Because fans do not buy tickets, with rare exception, but fans do not buy tickets to have pain inflicted on them on a long-term, multi-decade basis, okay? That's not what it's about. And even the great dramatic stories, you know, where fans have suffered for years, because when you have 32 teams in a league, it's hard for, you know, teams to win world championships every other year. The math just doesn't work. But at the same time, when you're selling hope, you need to ultimately win or come close and have that mythology and have that story and have that triumph and have that good feeling. I mean, growing up in Pittsburgh, you know, I'm 62 now. But I still have those fond memories of those winning teams on the baseball side of things from the 1970s, okay, which is a long time going back comparatively. But those kinds of victories sustain fan interest over time. And when you have free agency, it enables teams to sell more hope to fans. And so it increases the collective value of the enterprises in general. It actually imposes more of a burden on GMs and coaches, because if you don't win quick enough, you have fewer excuses. I mean, if the coach doesn't get the players from the GM, okay, or if the GM doesn't have good performance from the coach, but if the GM's hiring the coach, then that's a tough game. And I wish anyone in that side of the business incredibly well. It's really tough. But it just goes to show that if you negotiate, you need to open your eyes to broader perspectives. And how do you increase value? And in that negotiation, we ended up essentially selling the notion that this is going to be better for you as well. And it was. And by the way, media developed over time where sports properties and the live drama in sports properties became more valuable given what's happened with the media structure. Because when I first started, there were 3 networks. Fox didn't even really exist. There was 3 networks and PBS. And if you wanted to watch something on TV, that was all you could watch. It was an over-the-air antenna, and which seems primitive, and it was. And then cable TV came in, and that started, and things grew to a degree. But now there is so much media fragmentation that possession of an NFL contract, media contract, can be life or death to a company. And in some ways, the first time the NFL broke away from their standard TV arrangements was in some ways the biggest lesson, because Fox as a network wanted to establish itself as a national presence. And at the time, they needed to get local affiliates in order to kind of establish a broad national footprint. And until then, the NFL was sold entirely on NBC and CBS. You'd have the NFC games on CBS, the AFC games on NBC, and that's the way it was. And Pete Rozelle had talked for years about how proud he was that the negotiations were so civilized, and he would just have lunch with the person on the other side, and that it was mutually beneficial. And that can be very valuable. But Fox came to the table and essentially said, we're willing to pay enormously larger sums for you, for your rights. And it was so much more valuable that the NFL, in effect, couldn't say no. And that really made Fox as a network, because there were local TV affiliates that switched from NBC, or I think NBC lost the rights at the time, and it was just CBS and Fox for a while, and then NBC got back into the game. But there were affiliates that switched to Fox purely as a result of that NFL contract. And that's been increasingly the case with various media properties as there's been greater media fragmentation. And the end result of the increased value of the media properties has been increased value to the system as a whole. And because we have a system that is linked to revenues, with the increased revenues, the players have benefited too. It's not a perfect system. It's not the best system we wanted. It was a compromise. We won that trial, but the NFL said they would appeal forever. So it was a trade-off. And since then, it's been a series of negotiations in those sports where we're doing the same thing, but improving it. The fundamentals haven't really changed. But at the same time, there are, different challenges. We've had to negotiate all sorts of things this year with the COVID pandemic, which is something that nobody would ever wanted to have done. But you need to deal with it, and you need to deal with it in a way that's responsible and that works for both sides. The other thing I want to say, and I've been going on a long time, but you haven't asked me to stop, but right now we're involved in a series of litigations and challenges with the US Soccer Federation. And in some ways, I feel like it's a repeat of the same things that we did with the NFL when we got free agency, which fundamentally changed the structure of the sport there. I firmly believe that the sport of football, European football, South American football, soccer as we call it in the United States, is incredibly undervalued in that, and it's not organized very well, and it's being served, badly by people who have organized it to essentially, these are the allegations of the complaint, because we have a pending lawsuit on behalf of the North American Soccer League against both the Federation and Major League Soccer. And I won't get into all the details, and I'm not going to try and re-argue it. But essentially, it's to protect Major League Soccer from competition. Okay. And we also have pending litigation on the equal pay front for the U.S. women's national team, where they're not paid nearly the same for the same performance as the men are. And God bless the men. I want them to do incredibly well. I won't get into the details of the decision on summary judgment, but all that I'll say is, to the extent that the judge equated equal pay, the women got a ticker tape parade, in New York for winning the World Cup, and the men didn't qualify. So I didn't quite understand how that equation worked out, and it'll be on appeal. And so we're going to work our way through that process. But there's a fundamental common thread, which I think is that, and this ties in with my, foundational expertise in antitrust. And I don't believe the markets are perfect, by the way, and there are all sorts of markets with externalities, and I believe in minimum wages and all sorts of. I won't get into all that debate, but I don't want anyone to think I'm like a rabid free marketeer. But on the whole, to allow competitive pressures to work their, effect in markets to discern what is more efficient and what consumer preference is far better than command economies where people say, this is what you need to buy and you don't have any other choice. And fundamentally, I believe in that. And I think that the soccer, industry in the United States is very ill-served today, because I think it's based more on command economy principles than it is on competitive principles. And I think it's yielding bad outcomes. And I think it's very unfortunate. But how do you get there where you convince people that there's a win-win to be had and that you're going to end up in a much, much better position? And it's also more difficult when someone is in an entrenched position and they don't especially want to face competition. But at the same time, that's why you have courts. That's why you have sports lawyers. That's how you get into it. And so that's been a macro view, and I've gone on already for 40 minutes. I've probably broken the tape.
If you were to give advice to students who right off the bat want to work in sports law, what are some classes and or skills that you think they should take in order to be best prepared to work in this industry?
Yeah, some of this is easy, and some of it a little bit less so. You should learn in areas that are directly relevant to the structure of the industry. You should take cases relating to intellectual property so that you understand, because that's what we're selling when you think about it. Media rights, it's intellectual property rights. It's sponsorship rights, it's intellectual property rights. When video games, it's IP rights. You need to have an understanding on that. If you want to negotiate a contract, if you want to negotiate a naming rights deal, okay, if you want to negotiate a sponsorship deal in terms of somebody's individual IP rights, if you want to have an understanding of the difference between individual player group licensing rights versus, individual rights, and as to how the pie is cut up, you really need to understand the fundamentals of intellectual property, and that not so much patent law because that's technical, but in terms of copyright and trademark or negotiating IP rights, all of those things are important. For me, antitrust was very important because it related to this industry structure and what I, in particular, got involved in. I think it's interesting and important, and challenging intellectually, and useful to know. I'd recommend that, but it's something that you should do in tandem with a sports law class. If you're interested in sports law, you should take a sports law class. Anything relating to negotiation, I got to tell you, that is so important in terms of negotiating skills, and how you go about your business in terms of coming to an end point where you know how to get to reaching a deal. And sometimes when it's not advisable to reach a deal, I don't want anyone to think that you always have to reach, an agreement, even if you have to give up so much that your, client is in a really bad spot. No, there are bad deals too, and knowing the difference between good deals and bad deals is very important. The other thing I'd say, and this may sound a little kind of odd, get to know your classmates, and because your classmates are going to end up in amazing places like you wouldn't believe. And it's not, and people have different outcomes in life. I'm not saying that everyone is guaranteed, a golden pot at the end of the rainbow. But by the way, a golden pot isn't necessarily how we all should measure our lives. Okay, different people measure it different ways. But your classmates are going to be in incredibly responsible positions all over the place. Okay, and by the way, being a decent person, being a person whose word can be trusted, okay, makes a fundamental difference. Having friends who can count on you and you can count on them makes a fundamental difference, because there will be tough times in your life, okay, where you will need to call upon your friends, okay, for a shoulder to cry upon, okay, and or to celebrate a great victory. If you ask me, is that stuff really important? It's fundamental, because you can know everything in the world that's in a book and not know the world at all, okay? You can, at the same time, if all you know is people skills, then that can take you really, really far. But if you can't deliver when it comes to the actual legal results, then it will be a short-lived career, or you'll bounce from place to place, or you will latch on to somebody who will tolerate you, and you won't have the, because of friendships. But, there are people who've had long careers because they're good friends with an NFL owner or whatever, and they end up having good careers, but not nearly the same careers as if, they knew how to negotiate well and to deliver well. And so I would say, do well in your classes, do well in your schoolwork, care about the actual results, so that when somebody, what are you selling? Okay. You're selling your judgment. You're selling your opinion. And if you are later asked to attend a meeting, and then at some point and if you go through that entire meeting and don't say a word, okay, and don't give any feedback to your client or to your partner or to your colleagues, you're not really giving any value to the process, because what you're doing is, if you're being a good lawyer, is you're kind of learning about the world and the current situation and the circumstance presented. And then you're trying, and it sounds like a cliche, but you're figuring out a recommended course of conduct, okay? That's like in a very dry way, but you're trying to persuade people to act a certain way, okay? What is the job of a lawyer? The job of a lawyer is to persuade. Different people are persuaded different ways. Some people by pure logic, some people by personal connection, some people by being beaten into the ground to the point where they give up. Some people there are people I've done depositions and I saw that they had weakness in terms of their pride. I exploited that, and they bragged about something and made themselves look foolish before they knew it. I had one witness I'll never forget. He loved to tell a story, and I got him to tell an incredibly funny story, but before he knew it, he told an incredibly funny story that made his client look completely illegitimate in terms of the underlying science of the dispute. And sensing people's weaknesses, okay, is an important part of the job. It's funny because you need to be careful. Sometimes with like an expert witness you're never going to see again, it doesn't matter. And sometimes the case is so life and death in terms of the underlying economics. Okay, in civil law like this, we're not dealing with personal liberty, and so that's an entirely different thing. I don't want to ever equate the importance of what we do with people who are involved in criminal law. But at the same time, if you can figure out the best way to persuade people to agree with you, or if not to agree with you, to say things that are useful to your cause, then that is really what you're bringing to bear. And I got to tell you, this is kind of like general lawyering skills. People who go into a deposition, okay, and who read questions in a deposition, okay, maybe they're going to get some good answers, but you're not nearly doing the job that you should do, okay? You need to know the record well enough so that you can react well on your feet. But in a sense, when you're taking a deposition, the most successful depositions are explorations of the person you're questioning, where you're finding, because there's a lot of stuff you don't know, and knowing what you don't know as well as what you do know is more important. And so explorations of points of weakness and what you don't know and when to stop, and doing it in an interactive fashion where it's very, very personal in terms of any kind of process like that. I mean, I do a lot of depositions in this work, and it's a part of any civil litigation here in the United States, and arbitration hearings, cross-examinations. It's the same thing. Don't be so rigid in how you ask questions, and make that the case in all aspects of your practice. Question yourself, question your client. I mean, know how to be diplomatic, know how to make people feel good when you're interacting with them, so that they feel like they've learned something, so that they're bringing value, so that they're getting value from retaining you. Because don't forget, you're asking them to pay a lot of money for your skills. And so to bring value, the clients need to know when they're done that, no, this was the right decision to hire this person. And by the way, you're not going to win every case. In some cases, you're going to lose because the facts are just horrible against you. The better clients are the ones who understand that and who appreciate that. Some clients don't always, because they're not involved in litigation all that much. But a big part of being a successful lawyer, sports lawyer or otherwise, is managing expectations. And if you ask me what is kind of like the biggest issue for younger lawyers, it's a combination of communication and managing expectations. When you're interacting with your colleagues or when you're interacting with clients, people don't like surprises, okay? Again, there's a bunch of cliches, but they're, it's like that Bull Durham movie, know your cliches, they're very important. And so managing expectations and avoiding surprises is incredibly important to successful practice, whether it's in sports law or any other law. Have I missed any part of your questions?
No, you haven't. So I want to be respectful of your time. This was a fantastic conversation. So thank you so much for going over so much in such a short amount of time, actually. But thank you.
I went on, but I don't think I was duplicative. And
It was very interesting.
I appreciate anyone for their forbearance and listening through this.
Of course, it was very interesting.
You know what's the last thing I want to say just as we sign off?
Of course.
Whatever you do, care about what you're doing, okay? Because if the question is how are you going to do well, ultimately, develop the skills. You can have all the skills in the world, but if you don't bring them to bear because you're paying attention and because you care about what you're doing and you're actually, fighting for your side, that's maybe the most fundamental thing. Because you can be the most skilled person in the world, but if you don't give a darn, or if you're distracted in a way, when sometimes, families, I'm never going to say, don't devote yourself to your family. Balancing everything in a way so that you can do everything, it's a tough job. But, and this goes, I'll circle back to my dad who started this, okay? I'm not leaving out my mom, who was equally influential. But my dad, when I was a kid, on even the smallest things, he said, if you're going to do something, do it well. And I would recommend that to everyone because it's really fundamental, but people lose sight of it and they think, oh, that's good enough. And if you ask me, what's the difference between success or less success or non-success? Very often it's you get to the point and you say, it's good enough. And you just stop. Okay, what I do constantly, and it can be annoying at times. God bless my wife and my daughter. But what's so important is when you think you're done, to circle back and say, no, it's not good enough, and I'd rather check it again and check it again and make sure this is exactly the way I want it to be, rather than to just say it's good enough and move on. You have to understand kind of, because you can't be perfect in everything, but you have to understand where you devote that attention and where it's important to devote that attention, and to have a sense of proportion so that everything isn't a 100-page law review article when all you need is a 5-page memo. But understanding where that attention needs to be directed, and then being sure that your standards are high enough so that you protect your client and protect yourself and do not just an okay job, but something that, makes a difference is fundamental too. There's so much more we could talk about, and I'm sorry.
No need to apologize.
But there's a lot that's going on, and a lot of important things that need to be done. I do what I do day to day, but it's like everything that every single person does. Like I said, value your friends, value yourself, and it can be an incredible journey.
Fantastic. David, thank you so much for joining me and joining all of the Fordham Law community and speaking to some of your perspective on the legal industry and sports law. This was incredibly informative. To everyone else watching, thank you so much for joining us. Please make sure to tune in next time for Fordham Business and Law Associations in Conversation. Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Thanks.